Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I have to do this alone.
Hello, this is Chad Gross of the Apologetics 315 podcast. I am coming to you today flying solo without the heart of the Apologetics 315 podcast, Mr. Brian Auten. He is off doing important ghost-busting investigating. So I am at the helm today. Now, I will freely admit this is my first ever interview by myself. So this is either going to be a very monumental moment for me or a crash and burn, but thanks for coming along with me regardless. But I'm excited about today because we have coming onto the podcast Nate Sala of Wise Disciples Ministry. And I stumbled across Nate's work when I found these YouTube videos called Debate Teacher Reacts. And I watched the first one, and lo and behold, I ended up binge watching them. And you're going to learn more about what those are, but they're pretty much what they sound like. Let me tell you a little bit about Nate Sala. He grew up in a church, but left after graduating high school. While his pastors had spent a lot of time teaching Nate the content of the Bible, no one had explained to him why any of it was true. After converting to Christianity as an adult, Nate immediately recognized the necessity of apologetics as a component of evangelism in the 21st century, to which I say amen. In 2013, he created Wise Disciple to help Christians effectively incorporate theology and apologetics into their conversations. Today, Nate is a pastor, speaker, and teacher. His degrees in religion and curriculum and instruction give Nate a unique insight into the teaching and communication methods of Christ. And if you're interested in learning more about Nate and his excellent resources, I do encourage you to check out wisedisciple.org. Now, all that being said, today, what we're going to be talking to Nate about is debate. For those who are regular listeners to the Apologetics 315 podcast, you know that I, in particular, love debates. They're kind of my Super Bowl. In the same way people get excited about certain sporting events, that's how I get excited about debates. And so today we're going to be talking to Nate about things like, are debates even valuable? What's the best way to prepare for a debate? How do you objectively judge a debate? And finally, but not limited to, we're even going to be asking him what are some of his favorite debates. And so I'm excited about the discussion. I appreciate you joining us. So let's get to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
All right, Nate Sala, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. I am so excited to have the only other Samoan that is working in social media, you and The Rock, right?
That's right. We're making moves.
That's right. That's what it is. Making moves in media. That's right. You and The Rock. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became a Christian.
Yeah, so you brought up Samoa. So I was born in American Samoa, and my mom and dad, they met in the 70s, but it's an interesting combination because I'm ethnically ambiguous. I don't know if so your audience is probably audio only, but if you look up a photo of mine, there's a lot of things that I could be. Most of it is Filipino. People think I am, but actually I'm half Samoan and I'm also part Arabic. So wow. My parents, they met in a very unique way, fell in love. And I was born in American Samoa, grew up in church. So we went to Calvary Chapels quite a bit. My parents were actively involved. My dad's a prolific musician. And I also learned how to play instruments and things. But I was just not saved. So I had this interesting sort of pastor kid kind of reaction to the Bible and the things that I was being taught. I knew how to answer the right answers on the test question, but it did not resonate with me and I did not believe it. And right around 17, that's when I got the courage enough to tell my parents, I don't want to go to church anymore. I don't buy any of this stuff. So I took off and I stayed gone until I was about 30 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And at the time, I was living in Las Vegas. So I'm 17 years old, living in Las Vegas, going to college and doing everything I was told I should not do. And so, I ended up exploring a lot of a lot of situations and things that, if you can imagine, were not good for me, that were unbiblical and that were downright wicked. One specific example is I got into the occult. And so I started dabbling with Ouija boards at first, and then summoning spirits and manifesting them in my house. And then it came down to teaching myself how to read tarot cards, and it got really weird. To me, I thought it was all a joke, but clearly I realize now it was not. But then I got saved at 30. I basically, it's a very long story, but I had, there was a tragedy in my life. My father was in an accident. We thought he was going to die. And I realized in that moment, so William Lane Craig talks about this quite a bit, about this existential dread, that sometimes people feel. And I felt that. I felt the weight of my own mortality. I realized that my father, who I thought was going to live forever, he was actually going to die. And it was in that moment, very selfishly, I realized, you know what, I'm going to die. And I just had this moment like, oh my gosh, what am I here for? What am I living for? And so for the very first time I prayed, and I felt the Lord in that moment. And then I realized, this is, something's going on here. And so I started exploring that, going to church, reading the Bible, and I got saved.
Excellent. Praise the Lord. I know you have a ministry called Wise Disciple. Can you tell us about how you started your ministry? Can you tell us about some of the goals, some of the things that listeners would find if they went there?
Sure. Yeah. Wise Disciple. So it started. I got saved. And one of the first things I immediately wanted to do was I just wanted to know the Lord. I felt like I was in remedial training. I got saved when I was 30. That was 15 years ago. And so I was like, I'm at a disadvantage. I should have been learning more when I was younger. And so I jumped into school and I started getting excited about the things that I was learning in school, getting my theology degree. And so I started a blog after I graduated, and just posting stuff. And the blog started to take off. And long story short, it became a YouTube channel. I started the YouTube channel very late in the game, like just about 3.5 years ago. So right in COVID, we were all thinking outside the box.
Right.
At the time I was a pastor, and we're all preaching to the camera, and it's very strange instead of the congregation. And so I was like, well, okay, let's start making some videos and see what happens with that. So Wise Disciple really at base comes out of Matthew 10:16. There's this interesting one-off that Jesus tells his disciples before he sends them out to spread the gospel. And he says, behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. I figured, man, that's great. We still need that today. Maybe today now more than ever. And so that explains the title of the ministry. It explains that weird symbol that's behind me. Yeah. And the goal then is, and I try to communicate this every video I make, is I'm just trying to help you become the effective Christian that you were meant to be. Jesus has an expectation, I think, for his disciples. And we have to know how to navigate our faith well in today's culture. And one of the ways I do that specifically in the videos is I read the Bible as much as possible to show people that the Bible connects to everything that's going on around us. So,
Amen. Now, the thing that I kind of stumbled upon, and the reason I wanted to have you on today, was your Debate Teacher Reacts videos. And it was so funny. I don't even know how I found one. It just showed up on my feed. I watched the first one, and I mean to tell you, I binge watched those things. I absolutely loved them. And listeners of the podcast know that I absolutely love debates. They're like my, some people get excited about sporting events. That's how I get about good debates. And we may have that in common. But before, I know that obviously in the name, it says Debate Teacher Reacts. So can you tell us a little bit about your background in being a debate teacher?
Sure. Yeah. It's funny because when I started Debate Teacher Reacts, there were no viewers on the channel. It was in the very beginning of the YouTube experience. And I realized I needed a gimmick to get people aware of what I'm trying to do. My focus is more on evangelism and discipleship. So I just wanted people to just come to the channel and then eventually hear me talk about that. But apparently Debate Teacher Reacts like just blew up. And so it's funny that one day I'm sitting there and like I said, it's COVID and I'm like, okay, I'm on YouTube, but nobody's watching. So how do I get people to watch? I said, I used to be a high school teacher before I was a pastor. And back in the day, I was a debate teacher. And I did that for a number of years. I was in Las Vegas, so it was Clark County. And I thought, well, as I survey the landscape of YouTube, I'm watching a contingent of atheists, in my opinion, at the time, dominate the landscape. And I'm talking about people like Matt Dillahunty, maybe Aaron Ra, although maybe not so much now. But some of these guys who, especially with Dillahunty, with the atheist experience, they were just batting Christians around like little bunny rabbits in their big bear paws.
Right.
And so I thought, well, okay, let's do this. I'll utilize my background as a debate teacher, and we'll look at theology and apologetics debates, but I'll talk about it like more inside baseball stuff and call balls and strikes and see who actually won.
Yes.
And that's where that came from.
Yeah. Oh man, they are absolutely great. I love them. I think you do a great job with them. Now, a few questions about that, and then we'll get into debate more specific, because I think one of the great things about listening to your videos is not only do you get that play-by-play and calling strikes and balls, but you also get into the methods of persuasion and things like that, which I found to be extremely helpful. It helped me kind of put pieces together in the sense of, why do I find that guy so persuasive? And then after listening to you, I'm like, okay, now I get it. But what I always wonder is, there's so many debates out there. I could watch a debate a day probably for the rest of my life and not watch them all. How do you choose the debates that you feature on your channel?
Oh, that's a good question. So in the beginning, I really let the viewers decide for me. I would, in the community tab, I would put up a few options, maybe 3 options, and I would just let people choose by vote. Nowadays, I've sort of moved away from Debate Teacher Reacts and shifted to other types of series on the channel. And so I think lately it's still just the people who request debates the most. So like, for example, I just did James White versus Leighton Flowers on John 6:44. That was because that was highly requested. And so that usually tends to guide me is what people tell me they want to see.
Oh, well, that makes sense. Yeah. And I know that just had the whole blogosphere going crazy, and as far as that debate goes. So that would make sense. I mean, to be honest with you, literally while I'm watching the debate, I'm thinking to myself, I can't wait to hear Nate's take on this, which is probably exactly what you want, right?
Man, I'm not used to, so the channel's kind of taken off, and I think I don't see myself or the ministry, I guess, as being as influential as it is now. And so Leighton Flowers came out and reacted to my reaction. And actually, James White took issue with something I said as well on Twitter. And I was like, uh-oh, I guess I can't get away with just making these videos anymore. People are watching. So
yeah, well, that kind of leads to my next question. So in knowing that, if you're making one of these, and let's use the example just because it's the most recent one of Dr. White and Dr. Flowers, and you kind of know they're going to see it more than likely. I mean, like I said, I've watched all of them. And I think you do a really good job at being objective. I mean, honestly, there are some times where I'm watching and I'm thinking, man, I wish he'd show his cards a little more. I can't even tell where he stands here. But I love that you don't ultimately, So how do you remain objective when you're watching these, when I'm sure with some of them, there's a position that you more align yourself with than the other, not maybe particularly that one. So how do you remain so objective when you're doing that?
That's a good question. If I can get maybe a little pastoral, maybe.
Absolutely.
I at base, I pray first. So before going into something like this, I pray. But honestly, I try to keep at base my central focus on the fact that I love my brothers. And as difficult as some of these guys can be, so I'm not just talking about James White and Leighton Flowers, but like others as well. I love these brothers, and so I don't know. I want to see them succeed, So that's where I'm able to a little bit remain objective. The other thing is I keep a criteria in my head while I'm watching, and just seeing how both opponents sort of engage the criteria that I have in my mind when I adjudicate. And I try to keep it about the criteria. And that also helps me quite a bit.
Can you talk a little bit about that criteria? Because I'm just thinking that perhaps that would help other people when they're watching a debate as well, remain objective and not kind of just side with their guy, because it's easy sometimes to do that.
Sure. I mean, you're touching on sort of, philosophy of debate strategy and philosophy of debate judging as well. So when you get into the literature on the academic side of things, there's back and forth on what's the right way to judge a debate,
Yeah.
But and I'm not even well versed on all of the various philosophies, but the biggest thing for me is the interplay of argumentation. What I'm looking for, and the way that I say it in videos, is I'm really looking for clash. And so, when the affirmative gets up to take the affirmative position on a particular debate and they argue and further their case, the negative needs to get up and clash with the affirmative. And what that does then is it creates in my mind almost like this picture of two rams, like just charging at each other and then butting heads,
Yeah.
But the rams are ideas. And so that's the biggest thing, is who is furthering their position better than the other guy. That's one of the criteria that I have. This is typically how it goes. Sometimes it changes. So for John 6:44, it changed a little bit. And maybe I can, if you want to, I can explain that. But generally speaking, who is engaging the topic better than the other? Who is furthering their position and giving better arguments, I guess is another way to say that, than the other guy? And who is laying a better framework than the other opponent? What I mean by framework is there's this weird thing that happens in debate. And so you can split debates basically into two types of content. There's actually the things that are being said. So there's the arguments themselves. Then there's also the way to present those arguments. And that's an art form. That's what makes debate so interesting. And it sort of falls into the category of rhetoric, And so on that front, on the rhetoric side of things, laying a framework exists. And basically what it is the way that you narrate the debate and how it should be understood to the judge. In this case, it's the audience in the room. And so very often, this is so persuasive that, as a matter of fact, somebody could have better arguments, but if the other person lays a better framework, they usually win in the side of the judge. That's how important laying a framework is. And it's just understood in debate circles that that's the case. And so I look for that as well. I wouldn't say that tips the scales necessarily, but it's certainly a component that I look for.
Oh, wow. That's helpful. Now, one of the videos you did, which when I saw that you were doing this debate, I thought, man, this guy's brave, was the debate between, I bet you as soon as I say this debate, you're going to think, oh, I know what he means now. The Dave Farina, James Tour debate. Oh, man.
Oh, yeah.
But the reason I bring that up is not to go into the weeds on the craziness that it was, but that I thought you used that debate in such a great way to illustrate the logos, ethos, and pathos of a debate, which are forms of persuasion. And I was wondering if you could just unpack each of those and the importance of how they contribute to being an effective debater.
Yeah, that's another great question, man. So when you train to get up on the debate stage, again, you really are taught to think of it in sort of two categories. Clearly, you need to have the ability to argue well. You need to have some kind of a logic ability or background, but then you also need to know how to develop those categories of rhetoric. And so I didn't, by the way, invent that at all. I mean, that goes all the way back to the Greeks. But ethos, pathos, and logos. So ethos essentially refers to your credibility. There is some work that must be done as a debater on the debate stage to develop your credibility. One of those, so there's many ways. One of those ways is to just simply support yourself with good evidence. That right there, especially if you can recall them, especially in cross-examination when pressed, shows the judge that you're well thought out in this area and that you actually are somebody who you can support yourself with good reasons, good evidence. Pathos is just a way of the way that I describe it is developing an emotional connection with the judge. There's better ways probably to explain that, but clearly your tone, the way that you come across if you speak in certain ways. One of the ways to develop pathos, and we talk about this when we train students, is look at the judge. Don't look at your opponent, look at the judge. Why? Because if you have eye contact, you maintain eye contact with the judge, you'll connect better with them. And perhaps that will also help you in the long run with whatever it is that you're saying. And so those are kind of the way. Ethos and pathos are largely the non-logical ways, the ways that step outside of your argumentation proper to help you win. And then, of course, logos is the category where the arguments live. You have to, whatever you're saying has to be logical. It has to make sense. And again, it has to be supported by good evidence, good sound reasoning. For the argumentation side of things and debate, most of us use something called the Tolman model of argumentation. And so that's claim, data, and warrant. If you're doing that well, you're developing your logos well.
And someone who comes to mind who would be really good at the logos part would be someone like a William Lane Craig.
Oh my goodness. It's almost like he's, and I say this with much respect, and I hope this doesn't sound disrespectful, it's almost robotic. The way that he just does everything in the most precise way. That's probably why he is one of the best.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm thinking about is, I don't know if you're familiar with the philosopher John Mark Reynolds, but he wrote a book years ago with the late Philip Johnson on the new atheism. And I just want to get your take on this. And this is from memory, so it's not super precise, but it was right after that famous Hitchens-Craig debate, which was kind of the heavyweight battle at the time. Yeah. And he was saying how when it comes to the logos aspect of the debate, I mean, Craig just decimated Hitchens.
Right.
But that many people walked away from the debate thinking it was a lot closer than it actually was because of Hitchens' rhetoric, right? He's just a great storyteller, very good at connecting with the emotions of his listeners. And so
that's right.
How does one balance all that when they're debating?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I almost want to, like, the thing that came to mind when you asked was just practice. But you're right. There is a way to formulate your, so when you start out, so this question belongs in the area of prep. Yes. So before you get up on the debate stage, when you're prepping and you're gathering together what are called your briefs and all the things that you need to get up on the debate stage, you also need to think about how you're going to present yourself in rhetorically beneficial ways. And so usually this is all over the map because everybody has a different style. I think I interviewed William Lane Craig and asked him about what he does in his prep. And I can guarantee that's probably different than somebody else like James White or Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy or whoever you think of as exemplars in this area. Mm-hmm. But one of the ways that you can do it is you simply start off with, for some reason, I think this is William Lane Craig's approach. I could be wrong, so don't hold me to it. But you start off with the actual arguments themselves. So these would be called the contentions, and then the arguments that are connected to those contentions. You could start off generally there in your prep, and then work your way backwards towards developing rhetoric after you make sure that your arguments are there. The reason why I say that is because if sometimes people start with the rhetoric and forget about the contentions and the arguments, so maybe that's just a way of ensuring that there is that proper balance. And this is certainly ways that I've suggested to my students as well, to make sure the arguments are there first, then start thinking about stylistic choices later.
I like that. Yeah, because obviously the point there that Reynolds was making is that when he started discussing the debate with other people, he realized that while Craig, obviously from the logical perspective, just decimated Hitchens, Hitchens was very winsome and the rhetoric piece, as it always was with Hitchens, was strong. But then Craig kind of majored on the logic, and it was almost like between the two of them, there could have been more of a perfect balance if you gelled them together,
True.
Yeah.
And anything helps, I mean, again, I think you're right. The reason why a lot of people thought, even Christians, it's amazing because there were Christians who debated Hitchens, loved him. thought he was just a wonderful guy, could hang out, eat food, go grab drinks or whatever after the debates and things. And it all sort of comes back to these ideas of developing an emotional connection with people. Christopher Hitchens was just really great at it. Even to tell jokes. Christopher Hitchens could tell a joke. It was very dry, which is my favorite style of humor. And as soon as people laugh, you can hear it in the audience, he probably knew that he's done a little bit of work in the area of pathos. So yeah, it's all helpful. And William Lane Craig, I guess we could say that maybe he could develop that a little bit better.
Yeah. I wanted to say too, have you ever seen that film with Douglas Wilson and Hitchens called Collision?
No.
Yeah, it's basically a documentary of kind of the tour they did of the different bars and different venues of debates that they did when they came out with a book together. And that video really expresses what you're saying well. Is, Hitchens is saying some things that I just adamantly disagree with, but at the same time, when I got done with the movie, I'm like, man, I really like that guy.
Yeah.
So
that's great.
So you talked about debate preparation a little bit. And I did want to talk about, you mentioned some there, that there are various ways to prepare for a debate. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I wanted to get your take on this, that I've heard Matt Dillahunty say, and I know I've heard you say that you're probably not going to review any more of his debates. And if you want to share why, that would be super interesting, but I don't want to put you on the spot. But he says that he never prepares for an opponent. He prepares for the topic. So, for example, if he's preparing to debate the existence of God with Nate Sala, he's not going to go back and look at your books and look at your videos. And, I'm imagining you have all these things available and that he can go back and look at them. He's just going to prepare for that topic. So that leads me to the question of, should you focus more on preparing for the topic, the opponent, both? What's your take there?
So I'm trying to think why he would say that. I mean, so let me back up. My background is in formal debates. I was a high school debate teacher. And so where I'm coming from is more intercollegiate, academic stuff, going to tournaments and things. And so I've always felt this tension of trying to squash down the formal rules of debate onto the things that you and I are talking about now, which are the theology and apologetics debates that take place in venues all over the country. Because you can't do that. As a matter of fact, one of the issues, so I'm going to try to answer your question. So if I don't get back around to it, help me. But one of the issues that I've had for a while is the way that debates are titled. I think they're unhelpful because most of the time I've seen them titled in the form of a question. I come from, again, in a more academic background where debates are not titled as questions because that's confusing. When you do that, you don't even know who shoulders the burden of proof anymore. Because whoever takes the affirmative on a resolution that's written in the form of a declarative statement automatically shoulders the burden. But once you step outside that and you just start asking these questions, it just becomes a little bit more difficult on figuring out the roles of opponents in debate. And so that's just one example, I think, of, what I'm trying to say is like, you can't just bring that over and squash that down on top of what happens on the debate stage. But in formal circles, you would not know who your opponent is. You would ultimately take both sides and develop cases, especially in lead up to tournaments. You would develop both sides of a particular resolution, and then you would be ready by coin toss to argue both sides. So maybe that's what Dillahunty is talking about. I don't know. But when you're on the more, like what we're talking about here, Christian apologetics debates, these guys are published. William Lane Craig is published. He has, a lot of these guys have scholarship behind them. In those cases, you should absolutely research your opponent, because now you'll know what their arguments are going to be before you get up on the debate stage. And you can do some work to what's called preempt your opponent's arguments. And if you do that in your opening statement and you get out ahead of their arguments, then and the audience sides with your sort of framing of that argument, they're going to be with you. It doesn't matter. Then your opponent gets up and tries to make the same argument, but the audience already sided with you when you preempted their arguments. So it's very beneficial.
Yeah, and it also avoids kind of that. I mentioned to you, and before we actually started recording, the Bahnsen-Stein debate. That very famous debate. Do you remember the point where Stein gets up and makes all these arguments against like the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and Bahnsen basically gets up and says, "Yeah, I didn't use any of those." I mean, that was like, what? So thanks. Okay. I'm a presuppositionalist. Hello. I mean, right. Bahnsen said it much more thoughtfully and winsomely than that, but that was pretty much the idea behind it.
Well, that's a perfect example of what happens when you do not research your opponent. So that's very good.
Yeah. Now, you have said that you have done some debate teacher reacts videos on Matt Dillahunty. And you've talked a bit about why you probably aren't going to do any more videos on him. And since he's so prominent, I did think listeners would find it interesting just to hear your thoughts on why you might not think that's the best use of your time. Is that okay to ask, or do you not want to?
Of course.
Okay. No, I don't want to like put you on the spot. So if you're like, Chad, I really don't want to go there, I totally get it.
No, not at all. I hesitated and chuckled because, you asked me a little bit ago about how I can remain objective. And one of the things I said was, I love my brothers, It's interesting about Matt Dillahunty. He looks almost exactly like an uncle that I had back in the day.
Wow.
My uncle passed away, unfortunately, in a motorcycle accident. But
I'm sorry.
But so when I see Matt Dillahunty, even today, I just have this affinity for him because he looks like family to me.
That's nice.
But having said that, the reason why I don't have any desire to do any more Matt Dillahunty debates because he does the same thing every time, which essentially is to not make the arguments that are necessary for him to further his position in any debate that he participates in. The way that I've characterized it is, and I've seen, I don't know, 3 or 4 now, or maybe 5 debates of his, but he does the same thing every time. What he does is, when it's advantageous to him, he'll make an argument. When it's advantageous for him and he gets pressed by his opponent, he'll stop making arguments and he'll become a judge. He'll become part of the audience. And famously, he'll say the line, "Well, I'm not convinced." And that's what I mean. He becomes the judge all of a sudden of the debate that he's supposed to be actually participating in. And that is inappropriate. And it's a cop-out. And I just think it's a waste of time to do any more videos like that.
Right. And listeners, just to let you know, if you go back and watch those, Nate does a great job of remaining objective, but at the same time, he will point that out. And so if you're wondering more about what he's talking about, I encourage you to go back and look at those videos. Just do what I did when I found Nate's videos. Just search debate teacher reacts and you get a whole wonderful list. And then you'll binge watch them like I did. One of the things you do in those videos that I really like is you focus on the cross-examination. So in other words, if listeners are thinking, oh my gosh, I can't listen to this guy break down a 2.5 hour, 3 hour debate, you focus on the cross. Why is that?
Well, you already said it. If I were to analyze a regular debate, like the ones that we're talking about, it would be like a 6-hour video. And I personally don't have the time. I got 2 young sons, and
which I would watch though.
Oh my goodness. But yeah, so I can't make those kinds of long videos. And also, I always had the view, and I think I'm not the only one. I was talking to James White about this, and he agrees that cross-examination is where it's at. Like you can do all kind of work in your prep to develop your case in openers, rebuttals, and all that stuff. But when cross-examination takes place, that's when the magic happens. That's like when you get to shine. Like you get to showcase your abilities of sort of critical thought, but also quick-footedness, or not, and you kind of fall on your face, and it all happens in real time. It's an amazing experience. Cross has always, to me, been the most exciting part of debate.
Yeah, and you've really helped me in listening to cross-examinations now because you explained that concept that, again, I think I've always kind of picked up on, but didn't know how to quite put words to it, is you'll say, do you see what so-and-so is doing here? I think he's laying a garden path. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah. So laying a garden. So there's, if you talk to other coaches and teachers and probably judges, they probably call it something else. It's just what we called it, where I come from. But laying a garden path is basically developing a line of questions that start off seemingly innocent, but then they kind of end with a humdinger. Like the last question is designed to be a knockout punch in the boxing ring, figuratively speaking. And so when you lay the garden path, if you've seen enough of these, you start to recognize them that, they're heading towards knockout. And so I'll probably call it out like, hey, this is something's about to happen here.
Yes.
The other thing is in cross, including all segments of debate, actually, the art of debate and being good at it is appreciating the economy of words. And so, you know that not too many words can be wasted. Everything has a purpose and is leading to something. And that's usually how I can identify those things. That's
good. We've talked a lot about your Debate Teacher Reacts videos, but what other videos are you putting out?
Yeah, I have another series called Pastor Reacts, and I just it's kind of born out of I think a felt need. So as the channel started to grow, especially in the last 6 months, it's really started to grow. Praise the Lord. I've gotten to know my audience a little bit better, and I've realized that I say this with much love. I see my audience the way that Jesus saw the crowds in Matthew, wandering like sheep without a shepherd. It says Jesus looked at them with compassion. And the emails that come in, the messaging and things, it has some recurring themes of, I'm coming back to the Lord after a long period of time of being away. I need to start reading the Bible. I don't know where to go to church. I've been hurt before by Christians. I don't know what to do. And so I created Pastor Reacts to really help people understand the Bible better and maybe even understand what they should be looking for when a pastor preaches at the pulpit. So one of the things I do is I'll look at sermons and break them down, kind of in the same way that I do with debates. Is as a pastor and a preacher, I'll talk about what the elements are of a good sermon, and I'll identify them in sermons. I'll kind of watch those things too. So that's other stuff that's on the channel.
Oh man, that's another series I'm going to have to start watching now. Oh, well. Well, a few more questions about debate, and then we'll start winding things down. And these are just kind of fun ones. So first of all, do you have a favorite debate? Or we did a podcast once called Our Favorite Debates, and we talked about kind of our favorite debates. Are there any debates that Nate Sala will go back and watch again every once in a while, or you really think are exemplaries maybe, or something like that?
Boy, that's a good question. So what I generally want to see is, like I said, those two ideas running headlong into each other in a very rigorous academic way. So for some reason, the William Lane Craig versus Shelley Kagan debate comes to mind.
Yeah.
I think Shelley Kagan really handled himself well. And I understand there's some controversy around that too, after the fact. But I appreciated that for what it was in the moment. I tend to lean towards debates where it's not brother versus brother. I don't actually like that. There's something about it that gives me indigestion. I much prefer to see my brothers go up against those who are non-believers and do debates that way. So, William Lane Craig and Shelley Kagan. I also really appreciate good debaters. So I like watching Michael Jones. I think he's incredibly smart, and he's using the gifts that God has given him. He did a debate against Aaron Ra that, well, there really wasn't a whole lot of engagement coming from Ra's side, but I just appreciated watching him.
Yeah, if I could jump in real quick, we had Michael on the podcast to talk, and it was really interesting. We had him on talking about divine hiddenness, and I referenced that. I think it was before or after the podcast. I was talking to him about that debate, and I was really surprised with how much he manhandled Aaron Ra. I'm just being honest. I thought that you know how a lot of times, and maybe this is something you can speak to because you're more of an expert on this than I am, of course, but there's a difference between a rebuttal and a refutation. And a lot of times in debates, you get rebuttals, but you don't always get a refutation. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever seen a stronger refutation in any debate I've ever watched as when he just annihilated Arne Bra's view of what faith was. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I've watched that like 3 times because I'm just like, that is wow. But also it was really odd to me. Sorry, I'm going on a bit of a tangent. It was really odd to me that Ra is kind of the guy that comes and says, hey man, I'm all about the science. It's got to be empirical. But if you watch the debate, there's only one of them that's using the science, and it's not Arne Ra. He's using experience or perceptions. Did you find that kind of odd?
Yeah, well, not surprising, but yeah, I found it odd. Like I said, because we talked about why I started doing Debate Teacher Reacts in the first place. And I said that it seemed like a couple of these guys with big names were dominating the scene. But I knew immediately that they did not have the science and the argumentation behind them to support them. So I knew going into watching like, Dillahunty and Arne Ra that they're not doing the work necessary that a debate opponent should in order to get up on the debate stage, which is why it's funny because I get accused of bias from everybody.
Of course.
When your guy when your guy doesn't win, then I'm biased, right? But sometimes Christians lose. So in the debate series, if you go down deep enough, you'll see that they do. But most of the time they win. And somebody asked me, well, why, most of the time the Christians win? And I'm like, well, it's because they work harder at it. Like they do more homework. These atheists just don't. I don't know what is going on. They hear that there's going to be a debate 6 weeks down the line, and they don't do anything about it.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I've heard Dr. Craig say something like that at some point. He says that one of the things that surprised him when he started doing his debates years ago was how many of his opponents would just show up to the debate completely unfamiliar with the arguments and the content of the debate, and they would kind of present a kind of a philosophy 101 kind of case against God and weren't even aware of the more contemporary arguments. And so, that's really fascinating. So you mentioned Michael Jones. Are there any other debaters that you particularly enjoy watching? If you see they have a debate and you're like, oh, got to watch that. Is there anybody like that?
There are people I appreciate for their intellect and the way they handle themselves on the debate stage. So certainly William Lane Craig, Michael Jones, James White is another one. Trent Horn. I dig me some Trent Horn, although I think he fares better against non-believers than he does with believers. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
But I'm really appreciative of him and just very, like I said, I try to respect everybody who I react to and just see the potential in them and hope that they, that they do well on the debate stage, even if they're non-believers. And definitely Trent Horn. I mean, obviously he's Catholic and I'm not, so we're going to disagree. But I do appreciate his abilities as well. Do you have somebody that you really like?
No, I mean the names that you mentioned would be the names that I would probably say as well. To be honest, I would say Michael Jones, WLC. I particularly like James White when he debates the deity of Christ. And then Trent Horn. I think the only debate I've watched of Trent's that was against a fellow believer was his recent one with James White on purgatory. I think the rest have been against unbelievers. So I really can't speak to how strong he is when it comes to debating believers.
Right.
But
Dinesh D'Souza is also somebody that comes to mind.
Yeah, he is a good debater. That's true. I forgot about him because he hasn't been necessarily, he was kind of when the new atheists were going on and he was out there a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, he debated Hitchens and I thought that went really well.
Yeah.
So
can I make a debate teacher reacts request?
Sure.
All right. Now, I want to say to everybody who hears this, I'm not at all, demanding that Nate do this. And if he doesn't, that's fine. One of my favorite debates is Chris Date versus Dale Tuggy on the deity of Christ.
Oh, okay.
I think it's called, Is Jesus Human and Divine? Or is Jesus human or something like that? It's one of my favorites. And I would also love to hear how you would interact with Tuggy. But yeah, I think that one would be I think you'd enjoy that one.
Noted. I'll write that down.
Yeah, and selfishly, I just want to see it. I'm not going to lie. Okay. So before we finish up, where can listeners who want to learn more about you, they want to learn more about your channel, they want to start digesting these materials that you're putting out, where can they find you?
Yeah, so the YouTube channel is probably the quickest, fastest way to get all that content there. So it's youtube.com/wise disciple. I do have a Patreon, and there are things on there, because I know Patreon is known for its sort of, you jump onto financial support, to financially support people. But I actually do a Bible study with about 3,000 people on there, totally for free. Monday through Friday, every morning, we're going through the Gospel of Matthew. And so I encourage your listeners, if they want to do something like that, to just go over to patreon.com/wise disciple. And that's totally free.
Excellent.
And I hope it's a blessing.
Yeah. Thanks for making us aware of that. Well, Nate, I can't thank you enough for coming on. I can't thank you enough for your materials. I've gained so much from them. And honestly, man, it was just a thrill to talk to you. So thanks so much for taking the time.
Well, shoot, I'm glad to do this. And, a long time ago, so when I first got saved, Apologetics 315, was just one of those things that I started listening to. Brian Otten,
Yes.
Interviewing people that I looked up to. And man, it's just an honor to be here. I'm grateful that you invited me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Otten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.